COVID vaccine researchers are being targeted by professional hackers.
Hobbled traffic police and schools and forced hospitals to divert ambulances.
Hackers were able to gain access to the control rooms of electric utilities.
Good morning. My name is Giacomo Persipaoli, and I lead the Security and Technology program at UNIDIR. Whether you are following us online or you are here with us in the room today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 edition of UNIDIR's Cyber Stability Conference, which for the first time is happening on a hybrid format, combining online and in-person attendance. Facilitating dialogue among member states, technical and expert communities, including the private sector and civil society, is a core component of UNIDIR's mission. From the role of confidence-building measures in ensuring cyber stability, which was the theme of our first Cyber Stability Conference in 2012, to last year's in-depth discussion on how to strengthen global engagement, our annual Cyber Stability Conference contributes to the achievement of UNIDIR's mission by analyzing and unpacking issues we consider to be both relevant for the present and critical for the future. This year, recognizing the momentum generated by the two ongoing multilateral processes, the sixth group of governmental experts and the open-ended working group, we will be exploring the future of institutional dialogue on information and communication technologies and international security. 24 experts from around the world representing governments, private sector, technical community, academia, and civil society will help us unpack issues such as why is institutional dialogue needed, how do different types of dialogues can coexist, and how can they be mutually reinforcing? What is the role and purpose of multilateral dialogues in this context, and what can we learn from the extensive experience that international community has acquired in other domains that can then be transferred to the context of cyber? But before we begin, let me explain how each one of you, whether online or here in the room with us, will be able to engage with our speakers throughout the day. If you're watching us online, you can submit your questions using the Slido platform, and you will see now the instructions. You can submit your questions. You can vote for questions that have already been asked if you think that they're particularly relevant, and those will have a higher priority for the moderator. You can use the link and the code provided, or you can just scan the QR code with your mobile phone. If you are in the room, you can either use the same platform as our virtual attendants, or you can ask your questions in person by using one of the 4 stations that you see around the room. Please make sure that if you choose for this option, you speak into the microphones so that people watching the event online can hear your questions as well. Last but not least, I wanted to express UNIDIR's gratitude to the sponsors of this event. The conference is supported by the generous contributions of UNIDIR's Security and Technology Program core donors, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and Microsoft, as well as by the Russian Federation. And again, to the donors and the sponsors of this event goes our gratitude. Now, without further ado, it is a pleasure to welcome to the podium UNIDIR's director, Renata Duan, for the official opening discussion of the conference. Thank you. Renata.
You'll do anything to get rid of this mask, including coming up here to the podium to speak. So thank you very much. And it's great to be with you all here. As many of you know, since COVID began, we've been doing almost all our events online. And so it's really great to try this hybrid engagement. And I hope that's a mode that we can continue to use over the course of the rest of this strange and unforeseen period for us. Now, Giacomo set us off as to why we've chosen this topic for our annual Cyber Stability Conference, a conference that UNIDIR has held every year since 2012, or 2002, excuse me. So really, if we look at dialogue, traditionally, and particularly in arms control, dialogue has always been considered a critical tool and a standard instrument for international stability. It's not a replacement for more formal international agreements or frameworks between states, but it's often the precursor to them. And it's central when there are not established structured rules of the game. Dialogue, when we meet it, also takes place at multi-levels, across nations, across sections and functions, and across at different levels of states and non-state structures. So this holds true for many areas of international security, and cyber is not an exception to that. The issue of dialogue in cybersecurity and on cybersecurity, and particularly responsible state behavior in cyberspace, has been, as Giacomo alluded to, consistently raised in all the intergovernmental discussions that have taken place under UN auspices. It's been included in all the consensus reports of the various groups of government experts, even though the purpose of dialogue that they identified variously was emphasized or certain points came up. In 2010, the GGE focused on discussions of norms as the purpose for dialogue. In 2013, they highlighted confidence and capacity building. And in 2015, the application of international law was seen as a topic for dialogue between states. Now, since 2019, and with the launch of the first open-ended working group on ICTs and international security, member states are discussing the possibility of establishing regular institutional dialogue with broad participation under the auspices of the United Nations. I do want to emphasize, though, that dialogue is also taking place outside the formal structures of the UN, and we've seen a flourishing of initiatives in decades related to the security implementation of cybersecurity and ICTs, whether at regional level, plurilateral level initiatives led by states or regions. Some are private sector led, and indeed others have been driven by advocacy from civil society. So the purpose of today's conference is to really try to navigate the future of international dialogues related to ICT and international security. It's not intended to prejudge any of these formal discussions that are ongoing, but rather to contribute to them by supporting exchanges across a range of state and non-state actors, different experiences, different perspectives, and potentially also from different experiences outside the cyber realm. It's fitting, I think, that we do that here in Geneva, because International Geneva has always been the home of dialogue and coming together between different sections, whether humanitarian, human rights, arms control and disarmament communities, or indeed even the tech community. So I think this is a great city for any of that sort of discussion. This opening session, is intended to help us frame the discussion by really just providing some context and some setting into some of the key themes. We're joined today by 4 fabulous women And I know this is the part of the session that I'm supposed to apologize for the lack of diversity on our panel, but it's such a great privilege to have an all-women panel at the start of our conference that I'm not going to do that today. But we have first Marina Kaljurund, former Estonian Minister of Foreign Affairs and currently a member of the European Parliament. Marina is also a member of the Secretary-General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters, which serves as UNIDIR's Board of Trustees. So she's also, therefore, my boss. So good morning, Marina. We also have her colleague, Latha Reddy, co-chair of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, one of the early multi-stakeholder groups advocating for norms in cyberspace. And Latha is a former senior Indian diplomat who served as Deputy National Security Advisor for her country. Latha, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. We also have from Geneva, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who is Director of the ITU Telecommunication Development Bureau, and great to have you with us, Doreen. And finally, but certainly not least, Carmen Gonzalez, Head of International Cyber Policy in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Carmen is also a member, an expert on the group of government experts, so really brings with her an incredible experience of these dialogues that they've been taking place in multilateral spaces today. Those of you who'd like to read more about our speakers, you will find the bios on the conference program that you can download or on the tables. So I'm going to get kicked off straight away, and really I'm going to direct the first question to Marina. Marina, you've really been involved in so many of these dialogue initiatives for so long, but what is driving the urgency for multilateral dialogue on cyber stability and cyber security today?
Thank you, Renata. But to start with, I'd still like to thank UNIDIR for doing it. And ladies, it's such a pleasure to see you. I miss hugging you, I miss talking to you, but I'm sure we can do it in the near future. And I apologize, it seems that my connection is really poor. So if I disappear, it's not a statement, but it's something technical which might happen. But to start with, there was a very nice slideshow to describe how the COVID-19 has changed the world. And I would argue that for the world, it's like peaceful cyber 9/11. Peaceful in the sense that nobody has died from cyber. But this COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis has shown again how much we depend on ICTs, how we can be successful when we use ICTs, and how we can live when we are even better using ICTs. I'm coming from Estonia, a country that has been online and doing e-stuff for more than 30 years. So I would argue that for us, when there was a complete lockdown in the whole world, it was a bit easier because we were used to e-schooling, we were used to remote working, we had the habit, we had the means, we had the opportunities, we had the chances. This crisis has shown once again how countries and nations can be divided upon how accessible is internet, how free is internet, and how affordable is internet and the use of ICTs. So that's the positive side. But the crisis has shown also the challenges and vulnerabilities. So why do I compare it to peaceful cyber 9/11? For me, the first wake-up call was 2007, when we saw a country attacking another country via cyber attack against an independent state. This time we saw how COVID or pandemic, a disease, can start a cyber attack, can start attack against nations, against doctors, against people, against private sector, against everybody. It's global. So if we are not going to use this crisis and this momentum, then I would argue we are stupid as humans. I'm a strong believer in cooperation. I'm a strong believer in multi-stakeholder model, so I'm not going to repeat that. But what I want to underline today is the role of the United Nations. I'm not naive. I understand that it's pretty difficult to conclude something legally binding on the level of the United Nations because we still have ideological division. We use the same words: open, free, available, accessible, secure internet, multi-stakeholder model, but we act differently and we behave differently. The division has not disappeared. But even with this, under those circumstances, we have an obligation to come together. And that should happen under the auspices of the United Nations. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm really proud that I was one of those people who signed a letter addressed to the Secretary General of the United Nations General Assembly. It was a letter signed by people coming from different backgrounds, with former presidents, IT experts, private sector, academia, very different backgrounds. And we commended in that letter the fact that for the first time, celebrating 75th anniversary of the United Nations, we are talking finally about digital cooperation. But that's not enough. UNGA should have more attention on cyber stability. UNGA should have more attention on digital cooperation, building digital trust. I'll repeat what I said. I'm not naive, but we have to start globally somewhere. We have finally to start finding same language, same understandings, same perspectives. And of course, I'm looking to hearing from Carmen, because we've been speaking for years about inclusiveness, how states alone can't fight cybersecurity challenges. But what are we doing in practical terms? Are we finally listening to others? Are we finally listening to private sector, which is a drawing force in so many other spheres, and which was one of the forces behind Paris Peace Call, which is a huge step in the right direction and sending an excellent example of different stakeholders can cooperate. So to conclude, my call is not to waste this crisis that has taken already so many lives, and most probably other more lives will be taken in the coming months. So let's concentrate on how we can change the world into a better, safer place using ICTs for the benefits of all humans and facing the challenges. So states, it's a call also to you. You are in the driving seat. Start taking inclusiveness and multi-stakeholderism seriously. Listen to others, talk to others, cooperate with other actors. Only then we can be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. And you've really set many of the key themes straight out there, in particular, what's new about now, and is the global crisis of the pandemic illustrating both our dependency on digital technologies as well as our vulnerability in the face of exploitation for malicious purposes of those. Latha, I'll pass the floor over to you. Marina highlighted that cyber has been the topic of discussion for quite many years, and you've all been in many of these discussions. But what are the distinct features of cyber as opposed to other forms of technologies or other forms of relations between member states that are driving calls for such dialogue? Is there something different about cyber than other fields of intergovernmental relations?
Well, Renata, I hope you can all hear me clearly. I would say that what is the specific thing about cyber, about ICT, is that right now we are so dependent on virtual connectivity. Look at this very dialogue itself. In times of breakdown of physical connectivity, like what we're facing at the moment with the COVID pandemic and travel restrictions, everybody needs this virtual connectivity, whether it's for education, whether it's for government, whether it's for industry, whether it's for private users. So my point is that is the driving urgency at the moment, that this has driven home like nothing else, the need for cyber connectivity, the need for ICT links. Secondly, the fear of attacks, cyber attacks on our critical information infrastructure, particularly on our health services and the data gathered by these health services, because this is, again, critical information that we really need to combat this challenge. And I think you had also asked, why do we need it both at international and regional levels? I'd go one step further. I'd say we need international, certainly, which is happening under the UN auspices, and also, I would say, under private institutions such as our own global commissions and so on, and also regionally. I think to give an example, both the EU and ASEAN have really done splendidly in coming together on many issues, and I'm sure they will do the same in combating the present challenges on both technology as well as the COVID crisis. But I think more importantly, we need the same ability to coordinate nationally. Look at a country like India. You know, we have nearly 30 states and union territories. We speak multiple languages. And we need to coordinate at a time like this when, the Prime Minister speaks to the chief ministers of each state online, So I would say, how could we survive without ICT at a time like this? The sad part, of course, Renata and my fellow panelists, as you all know, is the question of inclusivity, which Marina raised. There are millions, literally hundreds of millions of Indians who are not connected. How are these children going to be educated if schools are closed and they cannot afford even a smartphone, leave alone a computer, to undertake their education? And, this is where the need for cheaper devices, cheaper data packages comes in. And while the government and the private industry in India are doing whatever they can, I'm sure these are problems that are multiplied across every developing country. It's there in Africa, it's there in Latin America. So my appeal and my urgency in this matter is we need to come together to connect the unconnected. If we don't do that, it's not a fair or equitable world. So I'd make a special plea for inclusivity as one of the urgent items in our dialogue. And without institutional dialogue, we can never prevent the breakdown of our current technological systems, or at least we can never limit them to safe levels. So for all of these reasons, I would say there is a driving urgency today. We have to recognize it, and we have to come forward and rise to this challenge as countries, as regions, and finally as one world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Latha. I'm struck by how much you and Marina are talking about the criticality of ICT and of digital technology for everyone. You're not presenting it just as a state issue, but really as an issue at the core of the functioning of societies, the equity of societies, the accessibility for people's development. So you're really placing it firmly in a human rights and in a development context as much as a security context. Carmen, you've been at the heart of many of these discussions in the United Nations between states on how to find ways to cooperating and to engage in this area. I think it's not dishonest of us to say that it has been challenging, and it's been challenging to find modalities. So, I mean, again, what's different now? I think both Latha and Marina have set out some responses. Just the sheer scale of a use and the COVID reliance on it have given a new urgency. But what are the opportunities and the challenges of trying to move forward to more regular dialogue in the current environment? A small question.
Yeah, Renata, that's really a small question for a Monday morning indeed. And thank you very much for having me, and thanks to Latha and Marina for their inspiring kickoff today. And indeed, they rightly pointed out that there is a great sense of urgency that we're witnessing today, of course, caused by or even aggravated by the COVID-19 crisis, about not only the importance of digital connections, but also of our great vulnerability. And unfortunately, of course, we are not only, we are also witnessing a rise in hazardous and disruptive behavior at the same time. And indeed, dialogue is something diplomats should be very good at. And so my camera is a bit wobbly. So why have we been struggling as diplomats? Dialogue should be easy as pie for us. Has it been the nature of cyberspace, its features, technological aspects of it? Might be. But I think we are learning by doing. We're getting better at it. We're a bit out of our growing pains, and that's indeed necessary, because now is the time to act. And fortunately, we have at this moment not one, but even two processes, two discussions, conversations in the UN ongoing. And I'm hopeful that that both will, in a complementary way, bring us a step further. Of course, there are still a lot of challenges on the way. I hope that the open-ended working group will agree on a full reconfirmation of the GGE acquis, of course, including on the applicability of international law as it exists. And in the GGE, we're working hard on providing an additional layer of understanding in relation to these valuable recommendations of the GGEs in 2013 and 2015. And what for me is very important is that when doing so, we demonstrate and explicate why these norms are still of undiminished relevance also today, vis-a-vis the challenges and the threats what we're facing now, because of course the world has changed since 2015. But I think we can easily explain that, for example, the norm on protecting critical infrastructure applies to protecting electoral systems, a very topical issue, but it also applies to protecting the availability and integrity of the internet itself, its public core. And last but not least, of course, we should also make crystal clear that protecting critical infrastructure in cyberspace means also keep your hands off essential healthcare services. And thus, I think that there is still a lot to be done and a lot of valuable work that these two fora, the GGE and the Open-Ended Working Group, can do. But that brings me to the idea of a regular institutional dialogue, excuse me. Because of course, even when the Open-Ended Working Group and GGE conclude their work successfully, there still will be a lot of work that has to be done, also in the UN context. But I do think that we should not rush and take a decision on format and mandate of such a regular dialogue now, prematurely. I think we should take our time to ask the right questions and answer them well. And it's my belief that we should use the Open-Ended Working Group that will continue its discussions until in the course of the first semester of next year to have that discussion and to indeed agree on mandate and format of such a regular dialogue there. When talking about mandate, what comes to my mind as the most important issues that we should tackle in such a dialogue is implementation and cooperation, not codification. I think it's too early for new binding norms. We should first gain experience, develop state practice, implementing this important set of recommendations and norms that we have on the table and that are being embraced by more and more countries in the UN. I think that's also the merit of the Open-Ended Working Group. So let's do that first. And when we talk implementation, to me, that's about having meaningful and frank exchanges on how and whether norms are abided by, and when not, what we can as international community do to incentivize responsible behavior. And promoting cooperation is about operationalizing CBMs and of course, fostering capacity building. And that's not only, capacity building is not only about upping technical resilience, however important it is, it's also about improving diplomatic capacity, because diplomatic agency will help the international community to work together and to take effective measures that will ensure stability and a culture of stability in cyberspace. Of course, the UN, and this is a bit off format, the UN has an important role to play. That goes without saying, because we're talking mainly about responsible state behavior. However, the UN cannot do it alone, and Marina and Lata have already referred to it. The UN should engage meaningfully and liaise in an effective manner with other fora, platforms, and organizations that are doing a lot of work outside the UN as well. Regional organizations, but also multi-stakeholder platforms like the Global Commission has done, and the Paris Call has also brought to the fore, as well as the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise in relation to capacity building. But that brings me also to this indispensable role of other stakeholders that Marina has referred to. Because indeed, I think that's something the UN is trying to facilitate, and this dialogue and inclusion of those stakeholders, but is still grappling with. We see that in the open-ended working group, where it still hasn't really come to fruition. So, and that's a pity, because it seems that not all member states are yet viewing inclusivity, and I'm talking more inclusivity of discussion and not the important issue that Lata raised of inclusivity and access to the internet. But when we talk about inclusivity of dialogue, it's also, we have to underscore that it's about including diversity of voices. Anyhow, one more last point I would like to make in relation to the institutional dialogue is that I think it should also be inherently flexible and adaptable, because of course, cyberspace will continue to change and the challenges that come with it as well. So regular reviews are necessary. So in conclusion, let's indeed discuss and decide on a regular institutional dialogue during the remainder of the open-ended working group and take sensible decisions there. Let's focus on implementation and cooperation, and let's really try to find a truly convincing way of including the private sector and civil society. And that will hopefully bring us a very future-proof and adaptable venue for further cyber work. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. And you got us straight off to, I think, a couple of issues around the what of dialogue and the question of focusing on what member states have discussed over the last 10 years, but trying to really look at that operationalization, putting in place those mechanisms to protect critical infrastructure, to facilitate cooperation, to support capacity building. Of course, the challenge is the speed of technology, and the way that it's moving so fast is sometimes difficult for, I think, policymakers to grapple with how you deal with the now when the future is being made as you speak. And really, Doreen, that gets to some of the technical aspects that ITU has worked on. I mean, how much interplay between the technical and the policy-making community is necessary and useful? Obviously, policy-making discussions will benefit, and the diplomats that Carmen referred to will benefit from that technical expertise and input. But where and how can that manifest itself, and how do you see it from your vantage point?
Thank you very much, Renata, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's really great to be able to join you today for this Cyber Stability Conference, which comes at the tail end of the UNGA high-level week. And I wanted just to touch on Marina's point in the beginning about the urgency, and then I'll come back to the interconnection between the technical and the policy stakeholders. You know, I think that we can't ignore the COVID factor, as Marina so well noted, and we need to also keep in mind that there are 3.6 billion people that are still not connected And really, COVID has demonstrated the critical importance of connectivity, but of course, at the same time, has also exposed the vulnerability to disruption and abuse. And on the one hand, COVID has put the spotlight on the centrality of ICTs to health, to safety, to keeping our societies and economies moving forward, whether it's through keeping us working, shopping, learning. ICT services and infrastructure really are providing continued access to critical needs. But of course, it has also heightened the urgency to address the rapidly evolving and critical cybersecurity challenges. And we did see a sharp rise in digital crime. We've seen breaking numbers of malware, phishing emails, global breaches that are costing countries and companies trillions of dollars. Healthcare facilities targeted by serious cyber attacks, impersonation attempts, disinformation campaigns, really lots and lots of bad news. But on the sort of plus side, let's say, referring again to last week at the UNGA, digital issues were featured more than ever before at the GA in heads of state statements and also in the UN 75th Outcome Declaration, where digital and new technologies, trust, and addressing the digital divide have been raised by many countries. And of course, also in that declaration, which pledges to improve digital cooperation and also to ensure safe and affordable access to digital technologies for all citizens. Of course, as Marina also noted, the open letter that came out on the 22nd calling on the UN to prioritize digital trust and security. And really for us, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And when we think about the 2030 agenda and leaving no one behind, we need to make sure that we're not leaving anyone offline. And so what does this mean for the two communities, the technical community and the policy community? I mean, I think because of the importance of digital, we can't just view it as a silo on its own. Digital and connectivity really cut across every sector of the economy. We actually see digital as a key enabler to achieve each and every one of the SDGs. And so these communities can't be working in isolation. And I think another sort of telling thing that we saw this year, again, due to the COVID factor, was even the G7 and the G20 declarations on COVID highlighted this, the importance of connectivity, but at the same time, the importance of trust and security. We've seen in our own meetings here in the ITU that where we used to have maybe more technical experts, that we now have not just the policymakers, but we have representatives of different sectors. So we have the health representatives, the education sector, finance, and many, many different stakeholder groups. And that's essential. The previous speakers have focused on inclusion. We're not just talking about digital inclusion, we're talking about inclusion in the policymaking and in our consultative processes. We do that in our study groups where we look at specific issues, technical standards. We recently had our global symposium for regulators where we ran a global consultation. Private sector contributed to that. What was interesting was a big focus throughout our best practice guidelines on the need to reduce harms of digital technologies, to strive for transparency and trust throughout the regulatory process. We have also embraced with all stakeholders in our revamp of our child online protection guidelines. We brought that out in June because we saw as a result of COVID, the increase in online harassment, the increase in cyberbullying. We have all these kids that came online earlier than their parents ever imagined. And we thought it was time to get our guidelines out there to make sure that, that the users, the policymakers, and the educators knew what needed to be understood before they had that online experience. Our cybersecurity index, by way of example, is also something where we work with different stakeholders, member states, partners from FIRST to the Global Cyber Alliance and many others. our national cybersecurity strategy, and many other things that we do here at the ITU. And we feel that that multi-stakeholder dialogue is essential to actually formulating something that can be useful for all stakeholders. The last thing I wanted to mention really is the importance of developing a culture of cybersecurity awareness. And I really want to stress the importance of capacity building. The previous speaker mentioned the importance of diplomats and the understanding amongst the diplomatic community of cybersecurity, cybercrime, and really that capacity building has to be stressed. We have a number of programs that we run on our academy, our centers of excellence. We have also been working with our membership at large in doing a series of cyber drills. We used to do this physically. Now we're doing this online. We have regional workshops, national workshops to do simulations and try to build that capacity in terms of cyber drills, and that awareness is absolutely essential. It's also important to note one last point in terms of countries' preparedness. There's still 90 countries today that don't have computer emergency response teams. And that's something I think we should be, encouraging countries to do that. So, when the next pandemic comes, when the next crisis comes, that countries are better able to respond themselves. Again, no one is safe until we're all safe. And it is times like these that we need to ensure that infrastructure services and applications that have proved fundamental in this crisis are beneficial to all, so that we leave no one behind as we recover from this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. And again, I'm struck at this focus on a wider population and people's development and security, stability, well-being, health, depending on ICTs. And what you highlighted, Doreen, is this enmeshing of a series of discussions. You talked about study groups, you talked about consultations, you talked about these tech standards and how they're enmeshing with the perhaps more structured and formal world of the UN and of intergovernmental discussions that Carmen is describing. And so a multi-layered sort of dialogue exercise that's underway. We have a couple of questions already in, so I'm going to flag them to you, ladies, if I can, and maybe ask one or two of you to pick them up. The first is from our colleague Serge Dross in the Cyber Peace Institute. How can we ensure that all voices are heard in the open-ended working group? The picture that policymakers have without all of those voices is going to be incomplete. There isn't going to be knowledge of the attacks that are happening against civil society. There isn't going to be awareness of people's lived experience if we don't bring that in, according to Serge. Carmen, do you want to take a stab at that? And then perhaps Marina, as one of the authors of that letter, and your point about lived experience?
Thank you, Renata. Very briefly, for the sake of and the interest of time, very important question. I hope that there is a way to change the blockade on giving more NGOs and non-governmental organizations access to the discussions of the open-ended working group. Until now, it has only been open to ECOSOC accredited organizations, and even then there are sometimes obstacles. I really would welcome a more open policy, and I urge all UN member states to contribute to that. And secondly, of course, there is always the possibility for other organizations joining the consultations, and I think there's still an open consultation round ahead of us. I hope so, because that was last year in December. That was a great occasion. I think discussions there had a huge impact, by the way, not only on the open-ended working group, but also on the GTE.
Thanks for being so brief as well. I'm going to Marina over to you on that question. This idea of how to bring in awareness.
It's a very good question, and I don't think that GGE or open-ended working group will change dramatically in that sense. because those formats are so UN state-centered, and the resolutions under which these both formats are working did not say explicitly how the multi-stakeholderism should look like or how the inclusiveness should take place. So I don't think that those formats will be able to change anything. Yes, most probably they will have kind of consultations so that politically it's correct, but no substantial discussion. So I would argue that we need new forums where we talk and we discuss. And as an example, for example, IGF Plus. We have IGF, where civil society, academia, industry, private sector, and states have come together. States have been for years very reserved about IGF, and I can be very open that I visited first IGF as an Estonian foreign minister, and for me it was too hectic, it was too messy, no decision-making power, so lots of questions raised. But after I've been there many times in different capacities, I understand the value of that forum more and more and more. So I would move the discussions to something that already exists and where states have to go to the event, not the other way around, because it's not in the DNA of states to talk to other stakeholders. And to change it, it takes too much time. Thank you.
Thank you. That's definitely going to be a point that will come up during the day. Latha, I have a question from a colleague called Malika. The GGE's role is to promote, according to Malika, promote international cyber norms. But what are the limits of the GGE today? It's a little bit in keeping with the same question. And very important, how can diplomats resolve cyber disagreements between states?
You know, I would say that there is definitely need for a multi-stakeholder system. I would agree with Malika there that states alone cannot hope to solve this problem. But ultimately, you know, what I would see as ideal would be discussions in a multi-stakeholder format, followed by the states meeting to implement those decisions. So the states would also have to be involved, which is why I think Marina's suggestion of having a really meaningful discussion in the IGF Plus with all states participating, and then taking that into a UN format with the UNGGE or any other group in the future, which could then formally get states to sign on to and endorse these treatments. Because, you know, I mean, these recommendations. Because let's face it, you know, I mean, while multi-stakeholderism is very, very important and we must consult everybody, finally states have to enact laws and states have to actually implement them to a certain extent. So it has to be a two-step process. But my suggestion is to make both processes more inclusive.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Latha. A final question, Doreen, I will send it to you, but you can perhaps, anyone else, feel free to engage. How can we ensure that the internet is designated as international critical infrastructure, with strict sanctions against the use of ICT as a tool of warfare? I mean, you already alluded to this, Carmen, in some of your comments. How can we protect the internet?
Well, thank you for that. I think I would go back to Marina's point before. We need to do this in a multi-stakeholder fashion, and we need to take advantage of the fora and opportunities for dialogue that already exist. So Marina mentioned the IGF Plus. I'm going to also mention the WSIS Forum. In some ways, when we spoke about the urgency of these issues, many of these issues were there. You said you had your first conference in 2002. Let's remember in 2003 and 2005, we had the World Summit on the Information Society, where heads of state came together, and they actually had a specific action line on building confidence and security in the use of ICTs. And ITU has been facilitating the leadership under that action line through the WSIS Forum discussions. And I do think that the Internet Governance Forum is another opportunity to further strengthen the dialogue amongst all stakeholders. so that we can come out with a better understanding of what we need to do to not only keep those that are currently connected safe, but as we think about getting the next 10% and the next 40% and we get everyone online, these issues are going to escalate in terms of importance. So we do need to act now, and let's not waste this crisis.
Thank you so much. I see that we have 3 minutes left, so unless there's any two-finger from the rest of the panelists. Marina, one finger, and Latha.
Just very briefly, as the question of secure internet, I do not see any other way of having understanding that it's good for everyone, but understanding is not enough. We have to have very clear norms and rules and international law protecting public core of internet. Then we can agree that we are more or less on the safe side. We have the same understanding and we have rules and norms regulating it. So that's why please look at the first norm of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, and that's why we're urging all states to adhere to that political norm.
Thanks. And that leads, of course, to a really interesting, bigger debate, Marina, about how do we make sanctions work and how do we ensure transparency, information sharing, pursuit of accountability. Latha, to you.
Well, I just want to add to what Marina said and point out that on the norm we're talking about is how to protect the public core of the internet. So we're talking about the infrastructure that holds the internet together, and we're very encouraged by the support we've got from the EU, where it's been enacted into the EU Cybersecurity Act, and the Paris Peace Forum, where over 1,000 persons have signed on, I understand, in entities, including governments. So that was what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much. And I think, Latha, that's a great point to flag that how we build norms and how we build the implementation is often a multi-stepped process, happening at the regional, happening at civil society, as well as happening at global and national levels. Ladies, you never disappoint in that you're always so engaged, so warm, so enthusiastic, so passionate. But what I really was struck by today is today's discussion is about security and stability in cyberspace. But you really enlarged the aperture of security. Your points that all of you made were about people's lives. It was about health. It was about privacy, people's records. It was about crime. And so you really have helped us open out a notion of security. So when we talk about cybersecurity, when we talk about cyber stability, we really need a human-oriented security idea and concept behind us. So I think that's one point to take away. A second point that you all highlighted is that there's a multiple set of discourses happening at different actors, different issues, different areas, sometimes exchanging for information level, sometimes with a view to a particular norm or task. And I think what the questions over the course of the day will really be, what's the role for different dialogue groups? One of you mentioned laws implementation. Another of you mentioned standards development. There's capacity building. So there's clearly a lot of different functions. And how do we ensure that the dialogues pursue different components so that it adds up to a mutually reinforcing framework of support, engagement, dialogue? So I think that's a third one that will come up. And the third issue that I think came up very much is that we have a bit of a tension here between the stately dance of diplomacy with its states, its procedures, its rules, its frameworks from the 17th, 18th century on, and the speedy world. You described it, Marina, as having found IGF messy, the messy world of tech and the speed of tech. And how do we enmesh both of those together? We need both frameworks. Our world operates around structures and laws, as one of you pointed out. How do we think about that? So I think these are the sources of the discussions that are going to come out today. And finally, I think it's important that we don't, and I think one of you mentioned it, I think it was you, Carmen, we don't silo tech and we don't silo digital digital technologies. It's increasingly hard to put digital in its own box, away from health, away from economy, away from trade. I think you mentioned this too, Doreen. So how do we find right ways to have focused discussions on digital technologies and the threats and opportunities they represent, but at the same time ensure that we pursue them in relation to specific areas and functions? So I think that's going to set us up for a great discussion. You've flagged on so many issues that we will try to touch on today over the course of the discussion. So can I just say, for friends, I hope I see you again in person before long, but it's always great to have you in person. And that we're now going to take a short break before resuming to discuss really the purposes and goals of dialogue, where we'll be looking at the specific institutional dialogue proposals and ideas behind that over the last few years. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists, Marina, Latha, Carmen, and Doreen. Thank you very much. And to all of you, join us in exactly 10 minutes and we'll set underway the next panel. Thank you.